"Henry Kravis just called. He says it's important." Robinson hadn't been asleep for more than 3 hours. When her head hit the pillow at 6 a.m., she had hoped the deal would be struck by the time she woke up. She called Kravis and was passed through quickly. "How am I doing, Coach?" Kravis asked. "I don't know, Henry," Robinson said sleepily. "It's 9:30 in the morning. What's going on?" "We just had a meeting. Things went okay, but we couldn't really tell." Kravis was fishing, Robinson figured. "I don't know what happened," she said, "but I'll find out and call you back." Linda Robinson put down the phone, then called the group at RJR Nabisco. Kravis insisted on keeping Drexel in the deal, she was told, and the talks were collapsing. Everyone was blaming it on Kravis. Oh no, Robinson thought. She called Johnson. He was still at home and knew nothing about the rapidly deteriorating situation at 9 West. Johnson was a late sleeper and hadn't let a $20 billion negotiation change his habits. "Things sound really bad," Robinson said. "They're way off track." Finally, she called Kravis back. "Everybody is really mad. What the hell went on when you met with our guys?" "Your guys were really tough." "Well, they say you were backsliding on all this stuff." When Johnson finally reached his office around 10 o'clock, he found Cohen, Goodfriend, and the rest in an uproar. Not only was Kravis insisting that Drexel co-run the books, they said, but he had now raised questions about the management agreement and other new issues. "They hate your management agreement," Cohen said. "They're taking a whack of that, too." Johnson could always tell when someone was trying to get a rise out of him. Cohen, it was clear, wanted him mad at Kravis. Confused and growing angrier by the minute, Johnson took a seat in the large conference room where the group was debating how to handle Kravis. Mostly, they seemed to be cursing him. "They're trying to take the whole deal. We're getting fucked. They're fucking us. They're fucking us." It made no sense to Johnson. As best he could tell, it all boiled down to who got the most fees. When he asked questions, the answers came back in Wall Street gobbledygook that only made the issues more difficult to comprehend. Half the time, Johnson couldn't tell if he was supposed to be upset. "I just bloody don't understand what the problem is," he said. Strauss tried to explain that splitting the bond offerings would be a logistical nightmare. "God damn it," Goodfriend railed. "What they're looking for is preposterous. We should just go out on our own. We'll never be able to live with these people." Disgusted, Johnson retreated to his office. He wanted no part of what he viewed as trivial arguments. He couldn't believe the agreement would fall apart over something as silly as which bank would run a bond offering. People shuttled in after him, complaining that the deal wasn't working. Johnson grew testy. "This is all horseshit," he snapped. "Nobody gives a shit about the company. Nobody gives a shit about the employees. Jesus, we've got a goddamn company to run. I've got 140,000 people to worry about. We've got to get going." As the morning wore on, Johnson waited for something, anything, to happen. The peace treaty couldn't fall apart. It just couldn't. This, too, he figured, would blow over. Inside the fishbowl, matters deteriorated quickly. If Kravis insisted on using Drexel, they agreed, there would be no joint deal. If there was no deal, it was time to bid. It had been 10 days since Kravis announced his $90 offer, Goodfriend and Strauss argued, and still the management team had no bid. They proposed to immediately loft a $92 counterbid. "It makes us real," Strauss argued. "We need to be penciled in as a player. We need a bid on the table." The price got no argument from Cohen or Jim Robinson. Of those present, the only serious opposition came from Steve Goldstone. To Goldstone, it was clear what this tactic was about. It was what traders called a "fuck you" bid. Simply put, Cohen and Goodfriend were so mad at Kravis they wanted to shove an offer right in his face. Goldstone silently cursed these men and their giant egos. He stood beside the great table and denounced the idea of a new bid, his voice rising as he spoke. He had been pleading with Atkins for a merger agreement, promising that management would come through with a blockbuster bid. If Shearson bid $92, he said, that argument would be moot. A $2 bump wouldn't bust many blocks. Once a bid was out, they lost their leverage with the special committee. Atkins and Hugel would know they had management on the hook and would pull for all they're worth. This won't scare Henry off, Goldstone argued. Henry won't walk away from this thing. It will only infuriate him. All you're doing is pissing off Henry and losing our leverage with the special committee. We're throwing away our strategic advantage. It's a wasted bid. Goodfriend didn't think much of Goldstone's argument and said so. Russ Johnson may write the check, Goodfriend suggested, but it was still Solomon and Shearson's bank book. It's not your money, he snapped. We know how we're going to proceed. For several minutes, Goldstone and the Solomon executives locked in a heated discussion of bidding strategy. Goldstone wished Tom Hill, who was in Minneapolis for a Pillsbury board meeting, were there to add heft to his argument. Finally, Goldstone's partner, Dennis Hirsch, leaned over and whispered into his friend's ear. "Hey, cool it," Hirsch said. "They've made up their minds. You're not their counsel." Goldstone stormed around the corner into Johnson's office. Spitting mad, he briefed Johnson on the situation, adding that the bankers were prepared to launch a counterbid. "It's a serious, serious mistake, and it's going to hurt us," Goldstone said. "But I can't stop them. They're completely hostile. They're not listening to me." Johnson listened as Goldstone went on about Goodfriend. Still, he remained unconcerned. This was a negotiation, and all negotiations get heated. Sooner or later, he told himself, they would calm down. Robinson, Cohen, and Nussbaum were appointed to make the final trip downstairs to Kohlberg-Kravis around 11 o'clock. Escorted into Kravis's office, Robinson did the talking. "We appreciate your negotiating in good faith," he said. "We both tried to cut a deal. Everybody worked hard. We seem to have problems that can't be overcome. If you can't move off that point, there's no point in discussing this any further. We'll have to go our separate ways." Kravis was nonplussed. "What's the response to our proposal that we gave to Peter this morning?" he asked. Robinson was every inch the diplomat. "It just wouldn't work," he said, not going into details. Then he dropped the bomb. "We'll be submitting an alternate bid," Robinson said. "We're putting it on the tape right now." "What?" Kravis said, amazed. As far as he was concerned, they were still in negotiations. "Why?" "We may win or we may lose," Robinson said. "But if we lose, it'll be with a structure that is best for our company and investors." When Robinson's group left, Kravis erupted, as did George Roberts. "God damn it," Roberts groused. "Russ Johnson didn't have the balls to come down here and look us in the eye and tell us that himself. I'm glad we didn't hook up with those guys. It never would have worked out." Cohen stepped out of Kravis's office, picked up a phone in Kohlberg-Kravis's waiting room, and called the group upstairs. "Go ahead," he said. Minutes later, news of the management group's $92 bid crossed the Dow Jones News Service. Kravis wasn't the only one stunned by the management group's bid. Johnson was floored. Brooding in his office, Johnson had figured the debate going on in the conference room was theoretical. Despite Goldstone's warning, he didn't believe anyone would actually launch a new bid. Not with a deal with Kravis so close. And certainly not without his approval. "What are we doing?" Johnson railed at Goldstone when he saw the news cross the tape. "This is stupid as hell. This is asinine. If all the negotiations have broken down, what the hell use is there in making an offer? You're not going to get a merger agreement." It would only anger Kravis. Linda Robinson arrived on the 48th floor and talked with Kravis on the phone at noon. He was livid. "I can't believe they did it," Kravis raged. "Why didn't they try harder?" He went on for several minutes, his anger flowing unchecked. Linda Robinson could only listen, irritated and a bit embarrassed at her own side's behavior. Johnson remained in his office, shocked at the turn in events. He couldn't talk to Goodfriend or Cohen. They seemed too pleased at having shown Kravis the price of messing with them. He couldn't talk to Kravis, who, in Johnson's words, was pissing fire. Just 17 hours earlier, he had managed to get a peace treaty. He hadn't wanted to invite Strauss or Cohen or any of the Wall Streeters. The whole thing had fallen apart over greed, pure and simple greed. And now, the pièce de résistance, his own partners were launching a $20 billion bid without even bothering to tell him. He felt like the man who entered the casino in a tuxedo one night and emerged the next morning in rags. Far worse, Johnson realized, he had lost all control of his fate. As Johnson moped, Goldstone reluctantly dialed Peter Atkins to inform him of the group's new bid. Atkins was pulled from a special committee meeting at Skadden Arps to take the call. Goldstone fought to disguise the displeasure in his voice. After their discussion of a preemptive bid the day before, he was almost ashamed to speak to Atkins. A blockbuster, Goldstone had vowed. As he broke the news to Atkins, Goldstone thought he could hear the surprise in the lawyer's voice. He wanted to explain, but knew he didn't dare. When he finished, there were several moments of awkward silence. He knew Atkins must be struggling with how to deal with the surprise of such a low bid. "Okay," Atkins finally said. "I hear you." Goldstone wasn't the only one unhappy with the management group's $92 bid. In Minneapolis, Hill stepped out of a Pillsbury board meeting to hear the news from Cohen. "I think it's a mistake," Hill told his boss. Now they were in an auction, and in an auction, the auctioneer has control over all the bidders. Once we stepped forward with a bid, Hill recalled months later, the board knew they had us by the short hairs. Afterward, everyone scattered. Cohen spent the afternoon in a New York Stock Exchange board meeting. Strauss and Goodfriend boarded a plane and flew to Palm Beach for a weekend outing with Solomon clients. Johnson simmered in his office. Linda Robinson stopped by Kravis's suite on her way out of the building. "We've got to do something," she said. "We've got to get it back on track." "I don't see how we can get it back on track," Kravis said. He was resigned to the fact. It was over. In the middle of negotiations, Peter Cohen had pulled a gun and sprayed the room with bullets. How do you negotiate with people like that? "You've made your bid," Kravis told Jim Robinson's wife. "You're on your own at this point." Financial studies were Frank Benevento's life. As a consultant to Johnson and Sage, Benevento loved to use terms such as financial engineering to describe his number crunching. Lately, Benevento had been busy studying the fee structures of major Wall Street advisors. On Thursday afternoon, he walked into Johnson's office with the results of his latest study. According to the percentile fees currently prevailing on Wall Street, and in light of the tremendous fees being paid the investment bankers and lawyers in this deal, Benevento said, he had compiled his own bill. It came to $24 million. Johnson nearly fainted. Everyone, he reflected, was out to get something for themselves. The directors, with their petty concerns about pensions and auto insurance, Kravis and his investment bankers and their fees, Solomon and its bonds, and now Frank Benevento wanted $24 million. There was no bloody way Benevento was getting anywhere near $24 million, Johnson thought. He told him to bill the company for whatever he wished. The matter would be dealt with when things returned to normal. Depressed, the Johnsons left New York on Friday morning, flying north to a hospital outside Albany. That afternoon, Johnson sat in his comatose son's hospital room for 4 hours. Bruce Johnson wasn't doing well. His condition had deteriorated seriously on the trip to Albany from Westchester. The Westchester doctors insisted it would be safe, but their Albany counterparts felt he probably shouldn't have been moved. Bruce's temperature soared. Johnson passed the day talking with the doctors, but there was little to say. Similarly, Kravis spent Friday with his own son. It was Parents' Day at the exclusive Middlesex school in Massachusetts, and Kravis drove up for the occasion. Afterward, he retired to his country home, hoping to escape the rigors of all-night negotiations and the rat-a-tat of press criticism. The media attacks had left him feeling besieged. At his darkest moments, it was enough to make him question how badly he really wanted to own RJR Nabisco. Was it worth the cost of being a pariah? Friday afternoon, Kravis suffered by far the worst blow from the press so far. King Henry blared the cover of Business Week out that day. The headline inside read, "Why KKR's Kravis may be headed for a fall, even if he wins the battle for RJR Nabisco." Carolyn Rome saw the cover at her 7th Avenue office and cringed. Kravis reacted as if he'd been publicly labeled a child molester. He withdrew into himself, morose. All weekend, Rome tried to cheer him up, but it was no use. She tried silliness and teasing and laughing. She joked they should enlarge it to poster size and hang it up. Linda Robinson called and passed on her condolences. Nothing worked. Kravis was stricken. Then, at his lowest ebb, something happened that should have made him feel better. Kravis didn't know it, but the tides of public sentiment were about to shift, strongly, in his favor. For all the debate over its contents, the copy of Johnson's management agreement that fell into Kravis's hands hadn't changed much in 2 weeks. Despite Goodfriend's complaints about its unseemly aspects, despite Jim Robinson's suggestions, and despite the fact that virtually everyone involved agreed it would be renegotiated, so far it hadn't. Peter Cohen had more important things to worry about. He passed responsibility for it to Jack Nussbaum, who passed it on to an associate at his firm. Negotiations would be messy and time-consuming, and everyone was busy battling Kravis. Goodfriend, having received assurances it would be cut back, was in no hurry. The keepers of the agreement, Johnson's attorneys at Davis Polk, were in no hurry. Steve Goldstone, curiously, left it to Johnson to renegotiate the management agreement. "Ross is a grown-up," Goldstone said later. "He knew he had to give it up. It was up to him." Day-to-day responsibility for the agreement remained in the hands of Goldstone's assistant, Gar Basin. Basin saw his job as looking out for no one's interests but Johnson's, and was determined to hold the agreement sacrosanct, no matter what Cohen had promised Goodfriend. For a week following Solomon's entry into the fray, Basin badgered Goodfriend's aides to approve it. "Have you signed off on it yet?" he asked. "Have you signed off?" Frustrated, Basin complained to Goldstone. "They're just fucking us over," he snapped. Irritated by Basin's demands, Solomon's lead attorney, Peter Darrow, also took complaints to Goldstone. "Your guy Basin keeps hammering me on this thing," Darrow said. "He seems to think there will be no changes. Well, there will be changes." Goldstone had no interest in fighting. "Agreed," he said. "It could wait." Among the few who wanted the agreement changed quickly were Jim and Linda Robinson, the two members of the group most keenly attuned to public relations. Both had recognized the agreement's potential to explode in Johnson's face. But Jim Robinson, the one who could have pressed for a change, didn't. As a result, nothing happened. The agreement simply lay in state, a time bomb ticking away. Friday afternoon, it went off. Linda Robinson took the call. A veteran New York Times reporter, James Sterngold, was preparing a story on the management agreement for Saturday's paper. From what Sterngold told her, it was clear he knew everything: the $2 billion, the free ride, even Solomon's opposition. Linda Robinson's first impulse was to come clean and discuss the agreement openly, but she was overruled by a press-wary Goldstone. When she informed her husband of Sterngold's call, corporate America's Secretary of State had a succinct reaction. "Oh, shit." Late Friday afternoon, Peter Cohen sat in the back of a limousine, cruising home. It had been a long, frustrating week, but despite breakdown of the peace talks, he still held out hope he could get Johnson and Kravis together. No permanent enmity existed between the two sides, and the clash between Drexel and Solomon seemed too silly to keep them apart. When he heard of the developing Times story, Cohen instantly realized the repercussions. If the pact had leaked, it could only have come from one place. Cohen immediately called Dick Beatty. "What the hell happened?" Cohen demanded. "I don't know, Peter," Beatty said. I have an idea how it happened, but it didn't come from me. You leaked that agreement to Sterngold. Peter, I didn't. I couldn't have. It's right here in my briefcase. The briefcase lay open at Beatty's feet. Peter, I'm not in control of everything, Beatty said. Henry hands out everything to everybody. In fact, Kravis had convened a meeting of his investment bankers Thursday afternoon, where terms of the agreement were aired in detail. Kravis hadn't trusted his advisors to keep their mouths shut for a moment. The management agreement, though, seemed like just the kind of thing they ought to know about. Any one of a dozen advisors, Beatty knew, could have been the leak's source. Cohen hung up, incensed. The battle for RJR Nabisco was escalating. The winds were changing, and they were beginning to blow hard in Peter Cohen's face. By Friday, Ted Forstman's bidding group was ready to surface. At first, Hugel's special committee, wary about giving sensitive financial information to the company's toughest competitors, had balked at welcoming Forstman's group. But Jeff Boisie's persistence had won the day. Boisie had agreed to a difficult due diligence process in which each document the group received was to be color-coded for review by only certain members. What broke the logjam, though, was Hugel's realization that Forstman Little represented a fallback position in case Johnson and Kravis teamed up. Hugel was certain the two would join forces. It made too much sense. If so, Forstman's presence would keep the bidding alive. Forstman, of course, ensured it would be a difficult berth. Friday, he spent the day at Lazard's Rockefeller Center offices negotiating a press release announcing his group's formation. He insisted that the release note that his group had been invited to bid. It was vital if Forstman were to wear the white hat. Peter Atkins refused. The board, after all, was supposed to be neutral. No matter how much it wanted Forstman in the bidding, it couldn't be seen as playing favorites. But Forstman was adamant. I have to be invited. Don't you understand? He told the Lazard advisors. Either it's there or I'm not. All afternoon they argued. Then, with Forstman on the verge of storming out, Atkins finally relented. How about welcomed, the lawyer suggested. The board would welcome Forstman's interest. Forstman agreed. During a break, Forstman contacted his office and discovered a message from Jim Robinson. Minutes later, he called and heard Robinson's soft Georgia drawl come on the line. Teddy, you know the respect I have for you, Robinson began. You run your business, and I run mine. Now, I'm not telling you how to run your business, but I want you to know that the rumor down here is that you and Jeff Boisie are trying to put something together. I want you to know our guys are jumping up and down stiff-legged about this. Forstman wasn't familiar with the phrase, but got the message that Cohen was irate. They feel, Robinson continued, they had a statement from you that if you didn't do something with us, you wouldn't do anything at all. They said you had agreed to sit on the sidelines. Forstman took a deep breath. Jimmy, this is very tough. I know you know I'm an honest guy. He told Robinson how he had stressed to Cohen that Forstman Little had three options: joining forces with Shearson, going it alone, or dropping out. Quite frankly, the last alternative was my preference. I just wanted to forget it. Now I'm not sure what we'll do. I know that, Robinson said, but you said yourself you'd sit on the sidelines. Forstman attempted to explain what he meant by the sidelines remark. He could tell it was no use. Listen, Jim, we don't know what we're going to do yet. When we do, you'll be the first to know. 2 hours later, Forstman called Robinson again. He read the American Express chief the press release announcing formation of the new bidding group. Robinson laughed. Gosh, my phone call sure had some impact. Forstman hadn't given Robinson's earlier objection a second thought. Good luck to you guys, Forstman said. And you, said Jim Robinson. Johnson slept late Saturday morning at his Atlanta home. Padding downstairs, he picked up the New York Times. Scanning the business section, his eyes were immediately drawn to a story at the bottom left-hand corner. Nabisco executives to take huge gains in their buyout, the headline read. Johnson, who never viewed the management agreement as the symbol of greed others did, thought the story was so wild it wouldn't have any credibility. It suggested the pact might be worth as much as $2 billion, a figure Johnson considered absurd. Only if every incentive was reached might they have reaped that much, but now, with bids pushing into the low 90s, that would never happen. Besides, everyone knew the agreement was to be renegotiated. "This is absolutely fucking ridiculous," he said aloud. No one would believe this. Would they? He reached Jim and Linda Robinson in Connecticut. "No reasonable person is going to believe this shit," he told them. "This is goddamn asinine." Linda Robinson didn't think the story was so far off the mark, but didn't tell Johnson that. "Ross, it's not a PR problem you're dealing with," she said. She had to make Johnson grasp the scope of the dilemma they now faced. "It's a factual problem. You don't understand. You can't just tough this out. You're going to get killed on this thing." Johnson's phone rang off the hook that day. One of the first to call was Andy Sage, the architect of the management agreement. Sage had read the Times story and, remarkably, hadn't thought much of it. "Oh, that thing," Sage said. "That's all conjecture. Nobody's going to take that seriously." Sage wanted to talk about the bank situation. He was concerned that Shearson wasn't making progress toward assembling bank financing. "I can only beat their heads so long," Sage said. "I just don't think they're doing the job." It was all Johnson needed to hear. Coming on top of everything else, he was beginning to realize the limitations of his partners, Shearson and Solomon. "Having watched and listened to George and Henry," he told Sage, "I would say we're a little overmatched here." Charlie Hugel, who read the Times story that morning at his Connecticut home, was also getting calls. His were from angry directors, demanding an explanation from Johnson. If the Times report were true, the board risked looking like fools for not knowing about the agreement. Hugel himself was also curious, although he was too contemptuous of the press to grant it any accuracy. He called Johnson in Atlanta. "Oh, Charlie, listen," Johnson said. "It's horseshit. Don't believe a word of it." The two men discussed the article's alleged inaccuracies for some time. "Listen," Hugel finally said, "will you get me a letter on it? Because I'm getting some calls." "Sure," Johnson said. The next day, Goldstone authored a letter to Hugel, which Johnson signed. "Saturday's New York Times incorrectly implied that I and a few other members of management could earn excessive amounts under our group's buyout proposal," it began. "This simply is not the case, and I would like to set the record straight." Johnson went on to suggest that his group's compensation arrangements were typical of LBOs. Furthermore, he wrote, much of the equity the group would receive would be distributed to large numbers of employees. "When we reached agreement with our financial partners on the allocation of equity," Johnson wrote, "I asked our lawyers in New York and Winston-Salem to analyze ways in which this stock could be distributed to our employees, and they are actively engaged in this analysis." Charlie Hugel read Johnson's letter carefully. In 3 weeks of conversations with Johnson, including the talk in which Johnson offered him a share of the purse, it was the first time Hugel had heard any mention of employees receiving stock. Not even the day before, when Johnson had the Times story in hand, had he mentioned anything about this. Hugel thought Ross Johnson was lying. Among the more surprising elements of the Times story was a passage suggesting that Solomon had misgivings about the management agreement. Goodfriend called Johnson Saturday to deny this and to assure him that no Solomon executive had talked to the reporter. "Well, I tell you, Johnny, you got some kind of canary in there somewhere," Johnson said. He left it at that. Johnson simply wasn't built for confrontations. Steve Goldstone was. When Goldstone read the Solomon reference, he went berserk. The first thought that crossed his mind was that Solomon had leaked the management agreement to force the changes it wanted. He put the thought aside. Not even Goodfriend, he said, was that stupid. "We've got to get Solly in line," Goldstone complained to Cohen that afternoon. If there's some changes we have to make, let's get to it. But this kind of public bickering shows a terrible division in our camp. They simply have to be brought in line. This is going to kill us. Cohen insisted Solomon would be no problem, but Goldstone wasn't so sure. Later, he had Gar Basin send Cohen the draft of a letter he was considering sending. Dear Peter, we have become increasingly concerned at press reports in recent days that suggest that the management group's financial partners are not fully supportive of Ross and the management equity arrangement that all of us have reached. Ross and his group are confident, based on your and Tom's, Strauss, assurances, that this is not the case. Nonetheless, the continuing rumors that surface in the newspapers are damaging to all of us. As a consequence, I am writing to ask that each of Shearson and Solomon write a brief note to me indicating that you are supportive of our existing arrangements. Naturally, we understand that as we go forward with any new proposal, those arrangements will be a subject for discussion among all of us. Sincerely yours, George R. Basin, Jr. On Saturday, Ted Forsman tried in vain to contact Johnson to formally notify him of his new group, and finally resorted to phoning Jim Robinson in Connecticut. Jim, I'd just like you to know I'm trying to reach Ross. I don't have all his numbers. Would you mind telling him I was trying to get hold of him? I think you ought to call him yourself. Robinson seemed in good spirits. Gosh, I'd love that. Robinson mentioned Forsman's new group. Would you still work with us, Ted? I mean, could we try to put something together? Is it even possible? An idea struck Forsman. Why couldn't Johnson join the Forsman group? Shearson could even have a role. Instead of shoehorning Forsman Little into Shearson's cockamamie structure, why couldn't Forsman find room for Shearson in his real money deal? Absolutely, we would work with you, Forsman said. No problem at all. We'd have to do it the Forsman Little way, no junk shit, no bullshit, but we'd love to have you. Robinson gave him Johnson's number, and Johnson returned Forsman's call Saturday afternoon. Ross, Forsman began, I hope you understand what I'm doing is altogether permissible. I wanted to tell you the true story of what happened, but I haven't been able to see you. Christ, I haven't been able to talk to you. Johnson brought up the Times story. My deal has been leaked to the press, he said. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, Ted? Forsman didn't miss the implication. Ross, I didn't hear that. I give you my word I didn't do it. I abhor that. That's a dirty fucking thing to do. Well, Johnson said, I will have a way of dealing with Mr. Kravis, if that's who did it. Forsman brought the conversation back to his group. You know, Ross, I think we're the best people in this business. We're your kind of people. You know where I get my money. GM, IBM, GE. Yep, John Welch, John Akers, Johnson said, ticking off the CEOs of General Electric and International Business Machines. I play golf with them. I don't blame you for going with all these junk bond guys, Forsman said, but in my deal, there's no junk bonds, no funny money. Johnson laughed. I don't have any junk bonds in my portfolio. Forsman allowed himself to get excited. This sounded promising. Now, Forsman said, Jim asked me if we could do this together. I said yes. I'm not trying to cut anyone out of anything. I'm not trying to do anything funny. We've got a reputation to protect. I know your reputation. Ross, you ought to seriously consider what I'm talking about. Talk to Jimmy. He's a very straight guy. He'll tell you. If we could get together, it would be great. You're the key to making this thing happen. I hope you'll be with us. Teddy, I'll give some thought to that. Forsman garnished his appeal with a personal touch. Ross, I wanted to tell you I'm very sorry about your son. God damn it, I'm really sorry about that. After Johnson thanked him, Forsman continued. You know, we'll both be around after this. There are more important things than who buys RJR Nabisco. You're right. It's important we remain friends. Bet your ass. Johnson had no intention of joining forces with Ted Forsman's new group, which he labeled the Five-Legged Elephant. As far as he was concerned, Forsman didn't have a chance in hell of winning this deal. On Sunday, they rested. In Atlanta, Johnson curled up with a stack of newspapers and watched football and golf on television. In Connecticut, A morose Henry Kravis wondered aloud whether the board had noticed the curious story in the Times. He paid little attention to Forsman's new group. Consortia, in his experience, were too cumbersome to win. In New Jersey, Peter Cohen took his son to a New York Giants game, and was probably the only father at the Meadowlands that day to sleep through the entire 4 quarters. That evening, a group of bankers and lawyers gathered at Cohen's Fifth Avenue apartment to plot strategy for the following week. Cohen was outraged at Jeff Boise and Ted Forsman, who he felt had given him repeated assurances they wouldn't pursue RJR Nabisco on their own. The possibility of a lawsuit was batted about, then dismissed. Jack Nussbaum suggested they write a letter expressing their displeasure. Goldstone and Peter Darrow saw no point in it, but Cohen seemed determined to exact his pound of flesh. Sunday evening, Ted Forsman was at his East River apartment, enduring a vigorous rubdown from a masseur once employed by the Italian national tennis team. Forsman kept getting interrupted by worried calls from his outside public relations advisor, Davis Weinstock. From the hostile tone of reporters' inquiries that day, Weinstock said, it was clear Shearson was displeased with Forsman Little. "They're claiming you did something," Weinstock said. "I don't know what." Forsman thought for a moment. He must be getting blamed for leaking the management agreement. If that fucking Kravis has convinced people I leaked this thing. As Forsman kept hopping up to take Weinstock's calls, his masseur grew frustrated. "How can I give you a massage if you keep getting up?" "Maurizio," Forsman said, "I know you have problems, but I have bigger problems." Finally, Forsman decided to find out what was happening. He called Johnson in Atlanta. Lori Johnson answered the phone at the house on Whitewater Creek Road. "Hi, Lori. It's Ted Forsman." "Ted, how are you?" She seemed genuinely pleased to hear from him. "Fine, fine. Is Ross there?" "He's on a conference call. It'll only be 30 seconds. Could you ask him to pick up?" Lori Johnson left the phone for a minute, then returned. "Ross says he'll call you as soon as he gets off the conference call." Before he could hang up, she said, "How's the weather up there?" Talk of the weather quickly turned to the conditions of the greens at Deepdale. They chatted for nearly 10 minutes. Forsman hung up, thinking what a nice wife Johnson had. As Lori spoke with Forsman, her husband was on the other line with Cohen and Goldstone. Both were alarmed when he mentioned the call from Forsman. That could mean only one thing. Like Kravis before him, Forsman was making a play for Johnson. "Look, I'm with you guys," Johnson insisted. "I'm not cooperating with anyone you don't want me to cooperate with." "Why don't we call Ted and express those things so you don't have to?" Goldstone suggested. He was worried that Johnson wasn't capable of dealing with Forsman firmly. "Fine, you guys do what you think is best." Goldstone quickly called Gar Basin with another job for the baby-faced hatchet man. 30 minutes later, Ted Forsman's phone rang. He already knew what he was going to tell Johnson. "Ross, I want to assure you I know nothing about this dirty leaking business. We don't do things like that. We abhor that." But when he picked up the phone, a voice he didn't recognize said, "This is Gar Basin of Davis Polk and Wardwell. We represent Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, and I am authorized to tell you to stop annoying them. You are imposing on them by calling them in their home. You will not attempt to reach Mr. Johnson directly anymore. Any communication between Mr. Johnson and you in the future will go through me." "I don't know who you are," the astonished Forsman shot back. "But let me tell you something. I called Mr. Johnson to tell him if anything funny is going on, I didn't do it. Mrs. Johnson and I were talking about golf and the greens at a club where I was on the board of governors and helped Ross Johnson get in. I'll have you know I talked to Mr. Johnson yesterday at the request of Jim Robinson." Now Forsman was rolling. All the frustration he felt toward Peter Cohen and his cigars and Henry Kravis and lawyers and junk bonds came boiling forth. "Let me tell you something. I know enough about lawyers to know who cooked this up. It wasn't Ross Johnson. I can tell now the lawyers have taken over. God help everyone. This is what's wrong with the world today. Guys like you and your little concocted schemes." But Forsman wasn't through yet. "I regard this as extremely rude. Rest assured that I will be spending time with Mr. and Mrs. Johnson when this is over, and rest assured I will tell them of your rudeness." And then he hung up. Chapter 13. The RJR Nabisco directors who gathered at Skadden Arps on Monday morning, November 7th, were a sullen, irritated bunch. For 3 weeks, they had watched in growing horror as Ross Johnson turned their company into the centerpiece of a $20 billion circus, and more than a few on the board felt like fools for allowing it to happen. Disclosure of the management agreement shocked most of them, and, by Monday, a rising anti-Johnson feeling was fast crystallizing on the board. Steve Goldstone had been right. These directors were no longer Johnson's friends. They weren't about to give him favors, and they resented him for putting them at the eye of an increasingly public hurricane. Several, including Vernon Jordan, had called Charlie Hugel over the weekend, horrified at details of the management agreement. John McEmer had been morally offended. "So gross, so unfitting," he had sputtered. Hugel had called Marty Davis himself. "Did you see the New York Times?" he asked. Davis hadn't, but had a copy within reach. He had read the article in mounting indignation. "What the hell?" "Can you believe it?" Hugel asked. "This is terrible. He says it's wrong. It's not true, but I don't know." News of Johnson's secret pact was the crowning blow for a board already feeling the pressure of an anti-Johnson backlash among employees, shareholders, and the media that would grow to ear-splitting dimensions in coming days. It was coming in a steady drumbeat of newspaper stories: the $52.5 million of golden parachutes, the 526,000 shares of restricted stock given to favored RJR executives, now worth nearly $50 million, the whole no-lose situation Johnson had set up. To make matters worse, the press had picked up on the favors bestowed on the board by Johnson, including the fat consulting contracts and the 1,500 shares of restricted stock each of them had gotten. The spectacle of Johnson's apparent greed, combined with the bitter public quarreling among the bidders, struck a nerve in a nation already sick of the unrest wrought by takeovers. From the outset, Hugel had been deluged with anti-Johnson, anti-LBO hate mail. "This is the ultimate in insider trading," a veteran tobacco worker wrote. "This group of insiders were entrusted with the management of the RJR Nabisco Company. In return, we are lied to, cheated, and used by a small group of insiders for their own gain. I fail to see the difference between what Johnson is doing and armed robbery, except that you will let Johnson get away with it for your own personal interest." Other letters pleaded with Hugel to fire Johnson and the entire management group. Somehow, a Winston-Salem businessman wrote, "there ought to be a greater value in this world than a stock price." Anger wasn't confined to RJR Nabisco's communities. A Nashville shareholder wrote, "The greedy SOBs don't have the welfare of the company, its employees, or stockholders at heart. Fight them if you can." From Boston, "What has this group of people done to enhance shareholders during their tenure? Nothing compared to their manipulation for their own pockets. What have they done for the community in Winston-Salem other than uproot the loyalties of the community? What have they done to build plants, hire and train more people to sell more and better costing products?" Directors took special note of a letter from Smith Bagley. The angry Reynolds heir demanded that a blue ribbon panel be formed to referee the developing auction. He questioned whether the committee could truly safeguard the stockholders' interests in light of the close relationships between certain committee members and Mr. Johnson. Bagley's letter, while never acted on, upped the pressure one more notch when it was released to the press. On a national scale, the fight for RJR Nabisco prompted new debate on the danger LBO debt held for the country. "Our nation is blindly rushing toward the precipice," warned Martin Lipton, the famed merger attorney, in a memo to clients. "As with tulip bulbs, South Sea bubbles, pyramid investment trusts, Texas banks, and all the other financial frenzies of the past, the denouement will be a crash." Federal Reserve Board Chairman Alan Greenspan urged Congress to have banks reconsider how LBO loans would fare in a recession. The comptroller of the currency instructed federal bank examiners to take a closer look at LBO loans. Senate Minority Leader Bob Dole and other politicians began growling about the need to reform the tax code to curb LBOs. On consecutive days in mid-November, two major insurance companies, Metropolitan Life Insurance and ITT Corporation's Hartford Insurance, sued RJR Nabisco. The value of both firms' RJR bonds had plunged as the stock had risen. The value lost by the bondholders will unjustly enrich RJR Nabisco management and other leaders of the leveraged buyout, Metropolitan Life Chief Executive John Creedon said. Former Federal Reserve Board Chairman Paul Volcker called him up and said one word: bravo. LBOs were generally unethical, charged ITT Chairman Rand Ereskog, who ordered the company's pension managers to stop investing in LBO funds. In an editorial headlined, "Why the RJR Circus is So Dangerous," Businessweek reflected the business establishment's distress. This spectacle is not just unseemly, it is dangerous, it held. It is precisely this sort of behavior that plays into the hands of those who want to shackle the free market with unnecessary regulation. LBOs, including a potential RJR deal, should stand or fall on their financial and economic merits, not on the childish behavior of the principals. For all the high-level hand-wringing, few felt the effects of the escalating fight as keenly as RJR Nabisco's employees. In Atlanta, office workers sat during lunch periods, glumly reading the daily news summaries the company issued. Isolated, irritated, and uncertain of their futures, the staff spent its days consumed with following the events on Wall Street, its spare time channeled into producing anti-Johnson propaganda. "It all started with a small lemonade stand in Manitoba," read one Johnson parody. "The next thing I knew, I had sold my mother. The rest was easy." In truth, the headquarters staff was divided between pro-Johnson Standard Brands veterans and the Reynolds mushroom farmers. Many of the undecideds stampeded into the Reynolds camp on disclosure of the management agreement. "We have circled the wagons," one disgruntled supervisor quipped, "and the Indians are inside." An editorial cartoon from the Atlanta Constitution was widely circulated. It showed a group of hapless people in a cereal bowl, on the cover of what looked like a shredded wheat box. "RJR Nabisco Shredded Workers," it said on the box. List price, $25 billion. RJR Nabisco employees across the country looked for ways to save their jobs. Second-shift workers at a Winston-Salem cigarette factory got out calculators and began figuring out what all 140,000 employees would have to kick in to make a bid. In Chicago, two third-shift Nabisco bakery supervisors took the idea of a $3.8 billion bid for all 14 bakeries to their superiors. Nowhere were workers more despondent than in Winston-Salem. It wasn't bad enough that their venerable tobacco company had been put in play by Johnson and Horrigan. The smokeless cigarette the two had sent into the market untested was dying a brutal death. Premier was the first cigarette ever to be returned for refunds. It was the butt of drive-time disc jockey jokes in St. Louis and Arizona, where it was being test-marketed. The product that was to be the great hope for Reynolds Tobacco was being called one of the great new product fiascos of all time. And while managers fought desperately to salvage it, Horrigan and Johnson fought their LBO battle in New York. Ed Horrigan put his house under guard and sent out a memo denouncing the Times story as speculative. A parody of Horrigan's memo received wider readership than the real thing. "We have decided to just take the money and run," it began, closing, "It has been swell being the CEO to such a fine bunch of chumps. Thanks for making Ross and I rich men. We couldn't have done it without you." Of the 5 members of the special committee, Hugel had probably swung the farthest in his judgment of Johnson. Unsure of his friend's motives from the outset, Hugel let his suspicions grow as the weeks wore on, prodded by a series of unsettling events. The piece of the action offer, the management agreement, and the anonymous memo suggesting the company was worth between $82 and $111 a share. When Hugel had confronted Johnson with the memo, Johnson had called it a lot of hypotheticals, suggesting it was the work of a junior-level staffer. Hugel wasn't so sure. Hugel's annoyance increased Monday morning when the Times carried a story speculating that Johnson's group might sue Forstmann Little over its new bidding group. Hugel felt he had bent over backward to allow Forstmann entrance into this fight. He wouldn't stand for Johnson and Cohen's suing over it. He fired off a letter to Johnson that morning. "Be advised that this committee is flatly opposed to your group taking any such action," Hugel wrote. "Whatever your grievances may be, this committee considers the Forstmann Little Group to be a credible bidder for RJR Nabisco. The interests of RJR shareholders will be best served by the active participation of that group in our process, free from interference by your group. Please confirm to me immediately that your group will not take any such action." Goldstone had written Hugel a half-hearted response, suggesting a suit was unlikely, but defending the group's right to bring one anyway. Each new disclosure contributed to the revised picture of Johnson developing in Hugel's mind. Hugel was chairman of the board of trustees at his alma mater, Lafayette College. Johnson, he realized, gave little to charity. Hugel had been married to the same woman for 36 years, and he wondered whether the changes he saw in Johnson could be attributed to Laurie. The phenomenon of rich older men taking pretty young second wives has been called the Jennifer syndrome, and Hugel was the kind of solid citizen who thought older husbands often did foolish things to show off for their Jennifers. He felt that ambitious women such as Laurie Johnson, Susan Goodfriend, Linda Robinson, and Carolyn Rome, in New York they called them trophy wives, compared notes on how their new husbands were doing, egging them on to grandeur. Of the other committee members, the Yale-educated Brooks Brothers-clad McAmer had long mistrusted the Manitoba-educated Cassini-clad Johnson. McAmer had walked away from Celanese with a $2 million severance package and was stunned at Johnson's $2 billion pact. Like Hugel, he was an old-school believer in fundamental business values and regarded what Johnson was doing as making all executives look bad. He was also a great believer in the board's prerogatives. He hated having been taken by surprise by Johnson. Johnson's most nettlesome director found a kindred spirit in the one thought to be his chummiest. Johnson had just put his friend Marty Davis of Gulf and Western on the board earlier that year. But Davis was nobody's patsy. He was a blunt, Bronx-born high school dropout who had risen in the movie business from Sam Goldwyn's office boy to head of Gulf and Western's Paramount unit. He had developed a fearsome reputation for firing and intimidating people, earning him a spot on Fortune's list of America's toughest bosses. As chief executive of Gulf and Western, he had faced down corporate raiders such as Carl Icahn. He had also overhauled the company from a sprawling conglomerate to a media and financial power. He knew how to value businesses, and he thought $75 a share to be insulting or bungling or both. Bill Anderson of NCR simply didn't like junk bonds, corporate raiders, or any of the modern falderall that kept business from doing business. At NCR, he preached a homespun philosophy of looking after stakeholders, employees, suppliers, and communities whose lives were intertwined with and dependent on a large company. Anderson had gone so far as to hand out stakeholder literature to other board members. He, too, was growing tired of the entire spectacle. Of all the directors, Albert Butler felt the heat most keenly. At home in Winston-Salem, he was constantly upbraided by anti-Johnson zealots who felt the board had sold out the town and its workers. He and Wachovia's John Medlin were lunching at a downtown club when an angry Paul Stick happened by. "How could the board let him do this?" Stick demanded. "How could it?" Butler and Medlin patiently explained that they had really had no choice, but Stick didn't want to hear it. Neither did anyone else. By the time the committee met Monday, there was an unstated acknowledgement that things had gotten out of control. It was time, the directors agreed, to take matters into their own hands. At the urging of Davis and McAmer, the board's bankers had begun working on a restructuring plan of their own. In theory, the committee could throw out all bids and restructure the company independently, giving shareholders a big one-time payout from the sale of assets. In practice, the board needed the restructuring as a club to wave before Johnson and Kravis, an alternative in case the two teamed up. More important on the morning's agenda, Peter Atkins had constructed a set of formal bidding guidelines, laying down procedures for each of the three groups, Johnson, Kravis, and Forstmann, to make its bid. For the most part, the rules were standard. Each of the bidders agreed to them within days. The key was the deadline, 5 o'clock Friday, November 18th, 11 days away. When the guidelines were issued that afternoon, Johnson groaned. A formal auction put all bidders on the same footing, meaning his group had squandered the last of its tactical advantage. In a call to Hugel, he tried one last pitch for a merger agreement, but got nowhere. As for the restructuring idea, Johnson thought it was a bluff. "Charlie, you'll get your balls blown off," he told Hugel. "No way you'll get $90 out of a restructuring." As the anti-LBO backlash rose to new heights, Kravis grew concerned that it might be doing irreversible damage to the firm's reputation. He and Roberts consulted twice with a pair of old friends, Gershon Kext and Marty Lipton, about what they could do to counter it. The consensus? Very little. Headlines attracted congressmen, they knew, and Kravis resigned himself to the possibility of anti-LBO legislation once the battle concluded. He tried not to think about it. "They can't do any more than crucify us in the press," Kravis said, "and that's been done." Still stinging from the Business Week cover, Kravis received lectures on handling the press from his wife, who had suffered her own share of slings and arrows in the quest for publicity. "Henry, whether you like the press or not, you've got to deal with it. So, deal with it," Rome urged. "What you don't understand is that you're letting the press be handled by the other side. You must put out your own side of the story, or it won't get told." "But there are no buts," Carolyn Rome said. "You're being hammered. You've got to get your story out there. Otherwise, the story that gets told will be theirs." On his wife's advice, Kravis and Roberts agreed to see a reporter from the New York Times that week. The journalist had in mind an extensive interview, but Kravis, after making sure it was understood that he had never uttered the word franchise to Peter Cohen, cut the session off after a few minutes. Tom Daly, a Kext spokesman, apologized for the abrupt and frosty end to the interview, explaining that the two were stressed out. The press wasn't Kravis's only worry. He was still searching for a wise man to provide guidance to fathoming RJR Nabisco's depths, and with just 11 days until bids were due, he was growing desperate. At Eric Gleacher's suggestion, he had interviewed Charles M. Harper, the chairman of agricultural giant ConAgra, about running the company. It hadn't worked out. Kravis had 2 meetings with executives of Pepsi, who wanted to invest in his deal in return for buying several Nabisco lines. While he had no doubt the Pepsi executives could help manage the company later, they couldn't help him now. Then, finally, Kravis heard the obvious name, Paul Stick. When Kravis called, Stick tried to balance his loathing of LBOs with his loathing of Ross Johnson. Stick considered LBOs a national scandal that produced no good for anybody but a few greedy people. But the rabid anti-Johnsonism of Winston-Salem, even his barber was rooting for Kravis, convinced Stick that helping Kravis was the right thing to do. The two men met at Simpson Thatcher Monday afternoon at 4 o'clock. Stick wouldn't come to Kravis's offices for fear of running into Johnson in the lobby or elevator. Kravis found Stick a genial retiree, a real gentleman, with none of the obvious bitterness toward Johnson that Tylee Wilson had evidenced. He obviously cared about the company and its employees. Still, Stick was out of touch with the new RJR Nabisco. His hands-on knowledge of the company seemed to be 5 years out of date. In the end, though, Kravis had to face a simple truth. Stick was all he had. The two men shook hands, and Paul Stick joined the Kohlberg-Kravis team. "Somebody take Henry's temperature," Johnson said when he heard the news. "He must be running a fever." Leaked to the press on Monday, Peter Cohen's letter to Forstmann Little read like a shot across Ted Forstmann's bow. Dear Ted, I am deeply disappointed, in fact dumbfounded, by published reports that you may be leading a group whose purpose would be to seek to acquire RJR Nabisco, Inc. You will recall that 2 weeks ago you approached Jim Robinson, Ross Johnson, and me with a view towards becoming an important member of the management-led group which was considering an offer for RJR Nabisco. I am sure you remember your expressed reasons for wanting to join us. In view of your strong desire to become our partner, and in reliance upon the specific representations outlined below, we agreed to discuss all aspects of our proposed transaction with you fully and frankly, including our economic models, our detailed financing arrangements, our proposed bidding strategy, and our preliminary thoughts regarding possible divestitures. We allowed Goldman Sachs, as your agent, to participate in our conversations based upon your and their expressed assurances that they would likewise be bound by the terms of the confidentiality agreement which you had signed. It would appear that Goldman Sachs nonetheless induced certain food companies to join your group, presumably using the confidential information which you obtained from us to induce them. I strongly urge you to very carefully consider your actions. Our business relationship, including our recent discussions, presumes a code of conduct which should not include either ethical lapses or breaches of contractual relations. Shearson and the executives of RJR Nabisco intend to honor the commitments they have made. We expect you will do so as well. I very much hope that you will carefully consider the contents of this letter. Very truly yours, Peter. Cohen's letter had a predictable effect on Forstmann, who fired back a reply the next day. Dear Mr. Cohen, through your letter of November 7, 1988, and your apparent distribution of that letter to the press, you have begun a program of irresponsible and false attacks against the ethics of Goldman Sachs & Company and Forstmann Little. By implication, you also attack the ethics of Procter & Gamble, Ralston Purina, and Castle & Cook, which have joined with us in considering the acquisition of RJR Nabisco. As you are aware, by attacking our reputation, you attack that which is most valuable to us. We believe that the motivation for your actions is to drive us out of the bidding process for RJR Nabisco in order to permit Shearson Lehman and certain RJR executives to buy the company at a reduced price. It is particularly disappointing that you should pursue this tactic because the RJR Nabisco management with whom you are working is obligated to protect the interests of RJR Nabisco shareholders. As I am sure you recall, we expressly informed you during the course of our discussions that, if we could not reach agreement with you, we reserved the right to consider our own transaction. We repeatedly made clear to you that we maintained 3 options. First, to participate in the transaction you were proposing if it were amended to comply with our standards. Second, to walk away from any involvement with RJR. Or third, to formulate our own proposal if such a proposal was invited by the special committee. After the special committee indicated to us that they would welcome our group's interest, we determined to pursue the option of considering such a proposal. The Forstmann Little Group's interest in RJR Nabisco works to the clear benefit of RJR's shareholders and has been expressly welcomed by the company's special committee. We will not make a proposal if, after careful review, this transaction fails to meet our strict financial standards. However, under no circumstances will we permit your efforts at intimidation to impair the interests of Forstmann Little and its capital partners. The firm of Forstmann Little & Company has been built carefully, with the highest possible business standards and with total integrity. We have acted in all respects consistent with those standards throughout this transaction. We need no advice from you in this regard. I hope this puts to rest the phony controversy which you have manufactured. Unlike you, we do not intend to release this letter to the press. Very truly yours, Theodore J. Forsman. Cohen had sent a similar letter to each of Forsman's bidding partners, including the respected senior partner of Goldman Sachs, John L. Weinberg. Weinberg's reply read like a senior statesman chastising a junior colleague. Dear Peter, I received your letter of November 7th, 1988, at approximately the same time I received a call from the press, and thus it is clear to me that your letter was for purposes of public relations rather than communication with us. It is also clear that you don't know me very well, otherwise you wouldn't have wasted your and my time with insults or threats, particularly when you have not gotten your facts straight. In my judgment, your letter is not worthy of reply. However, my colleagues have persuaded me that it is appropriate to give you a written response. Your letter is factually erroneous and totally unwarranted. Goldman Sachs has not violated any of the terms of the confidentiality agreements which Forsman Little signed with RJR Nabisco. As you know, I was not personally present, but I am categorically advised by my colleagues that our clear message to you has been that we might proceed independently of management or Shearson, and we're actively considering that possibility. Goldman Sachs is not precluded by any agreement with Shearson or RJR Nabisco from pursuing that alternative or making proposals for RJR Nabisco that would be received favorably by the company and its shareholders. This view is clearly shared by the company's Committee of Independent Directors. As it publicly reaffirmed today, the committee has welcomed the potential interest of Forsman Little, Goldman Sachs, and the highly respected companies with which we are working. I find it difficult, if not impossible, to take seriously your professed interest in good relationships with Goldman Sachs. It is not conducive to any relationship between our firms for you to make charges such as those in your November 7th letter, or to seek to exploit them by releasing them to the